All right, it is time for us to talk about numbers, right? Numbers are at the core of everything we're doing in electronic music because ultimately everything we're doing is based on systems that run on numbers, right? Whether it's computing, digital audio processing, or MIDI-based control, even OSC control, all number-based. All right, so let's get into our first and most important number system for digital audio, and that's binary. So binary is the system that only represents things in zeros and ones because it's just representing on and off, right? You know, on being one and off being zero. And this system is super robust and super valuable because of how it is able to tolerate noise, right? So if we have an analog signal, you know, that's oscillating like this over time, and we add a little bit of noise to it, what we get is a fuzzy waveform. Now, if we take a digital signal and add a little bit of noise to it, what we get is fuzzy high and fuzzy low. But the moment we run this through any other digital system, it compares the voltage to a threshold, and our resulting signal is a nice clean high and low. So it totally rejects the noise up to a point. I mean, you would have to have very extreme amounts of noise to not get that beautiful clean signal. And there's some other things that people can do with electronics and signal processing to make the tolerance for noise very high. So binary, super robust, very valuable for doing anything that requires like making copies of things or wanting to have something that's recorded be playable and accurate later. Because with the noise thing with analog, you know, if every process, because in reality, every process of analog processing in any way, just playing it back and recording it or anything like this adds a little bit of electronic noise to the signal. And at some point, there is enough electronic noise that your signal is heard less well against the noise in the backdrop. You could think of this as like making a copy, or if you made a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, eventually the thing just gets noisy and gross. You know, there's actually a tumor, like a cancer example that people use as an illustration of why like copying things imperfectly is, you know, not ideal for things that you want to have the fidelity of the original. You know, it's a cool way to make art, but maybe not the way to make a good copy. So what else, how does binary work per se? Like how you go from on and off to representing musical digital audio? Well, let's get into like how binary is used, right? When we are trying to represent a number other than 1 and 0 using binary, we use combinations of binary integers. We for short, we call them bits. So if we want to represent a range of numbers between 0 and 16, we group 4 bits together and we get a number. So this little binary word is equivalent to 3 in decimal, right? Because it's, if you're doing like the breakdown, you've got 1 in the ones place, 1 in the twos place, 0 in the fours place, and 0 in the eights place. So no 8, no 4. So it's 2 plus 1, 3. Bam. And this goes, you know, this scales up. You know, we could, if we wanted to represent a number between 0 and 64, we would go with a larger number. Oh, let's do a higher number. Let's say we wanted to represent a range of numbers between 0 and 100. For that, we would need about 7 bits. And this would give us a bit in the ones place, twos place, fours place, 8s, 16s, 32s, and 64s. Right, and with that range of numbers, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7 bits. That gets us where we need to go. So why is this interesting? Why would we want to know about 7 bits or anything like this? Well, as it turns out, we're seeing this 7-bit thing come up a lot when we're dealing with MIDI or we're dealing with mapping in Ableton Live or any of these sort of things, because you've seen this range of numbers probably all the time, right? And you're thinking to yourself, why 0 to 127? Like our brains really like to work with systems based on 10. You know, we have the 10 digits. We've built a counting system, a whole mathematical system really around decimal, around 10 points. Why are we using this range of numbers instead of 0 to 100, 0 to 127? That seems kind of weird. Well, that gives us the most steps for the least amount of bits. In our case, we're using a 7-bit number, which is really based on MIDI, which is an 8-bit or byte by 8-byte system. The first bit in a MIDI, like a message block, says something about what type of MIDI message it is, whether it's a message having to do with notes or control turns and these sorts of things, or if the message has more to do with system control or something like this. Like, so they have channel message and they have system exclusive messages. And that first bit in the 8-bit byte is what indicates this. So that leaves you 7 bits to give you as much control data as you can get. And, you know, if we're trying to represent, say, I don't know, 88 piano keys, we're going to need more than 6 bits, because 6 bits only gets us to about 0 to 63. That doesn't quite cover the 88 notes. 8 bits would be overkill, because that'd be like 255 steps. So 7 bits works just fine. And the same goes with our control stuff. So we have a knob we can turn between 0 and 127, and then we can assign that to control any sort of musical effect or parameter. And we'll go a little bit into why that's a challenge a little later. So what else is binary useful for? One of my favorite things for binary is making decisions, and like making decisions really simply, and troubleshooting. So in terms of making decisions, if you have a long list and you want to arbitrarily decide, make a choice in that list, and you don't want to like go through all of the cognitive steps, you just want to arbitrarily choose an item from the list, you can do really simple things like take the list and cut it in half, and then, I don't know, flip a coin or something and say, okay, I'm going to choose, like, let's say we have a list of 16 items and we want to choose one of them arbitrarily. All right, so we split the list in half, and we have the top 8 and the bottom 8. We flip a coin. If it's tails, we'll go with the top 8. If it's heads, we go with the bottom 8. And then, so we get a result of 8 things that we're now looking at. And then let's split that in half, and we'll flip a coin, and we'll choose between the first 4 and the second 4. We'll split it again, 2 and 2. And then when we get down to 2, we just flip it one more time, and we get our result, the thing we're choosing. Right? So it's one flip here, one flip here, one flip here, one flip here. So 4 coin flips gets us a decision in a list of 16 things, right? And if you have, let's see, 32 things, that would be 5 coin flips. 64 things, 6 coin flips. 127 things, 128 things, that's 7 coin flips. So you can see very quickly that with a handful of coin flips, you can make decisions from a large collection, without, having to do anything more complicated than flip a coin and draw a line. So the other thing that I really like using binary for is, like I said, troubleshooting. So in the industry I work in, we do a lot of things with complex AV gear where you have a lot of items in a chain. And if something doesn't work, we have this challenge of like, you get a report, something's not working. Okay, now what? So, and keep in mind, you might have like seconds or minutes to solve the problem. And when you're in music production, and you're dealing with something like this, where you have a complex chain and something's causing trouble, and you don't want to spend the rest of the afternoon debugging the thing. You want to find like a super efficient solution to coming to the answer of what the problem is. So one approach is you start at the beginning and you test each item. So you do a test, you do a test, you do a test, right? And you go on down the chain. Now, let's just say, for example, I have a problem in this item here. Now, I wouldn't know this in advance, but for the sake of this illustration, let's go ahead and say that's where the problem is. If I start at this end, I have to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 tests to get to that problem. All right. Well, maybe I'm lucky and I decided to start at this end, in which case I have 1, 2, 3 tests to find the problem. That's great, but it puts a lot of what do you call that? I don't know. It's not statistically reliable. because there'll be one time that I'm really late, one time that I'm a hero because I'm super early. But I need to be consistent in my professional life. I need to be able to solve problems consistently, quickly, and be able to tell someone how long it should take to solve said problem. So what I often do is I take whatever the complex system is and I split it right in half, wherever I can make a dividing line. So in this case, I've got 5 items, 4 items. I'm going to split it right here, right? So I'm going to test this entire half and this entire half, right? In this particular example, this half will pass, this half will fail. Okay, so then I split this half. All right, this half will pass, and this other group will fail, right? And now I'm going to split it. Let's be maximum inefficiency here. I'm going to split it here. This half will pass, this half will fail, and then I split it one last time, and I get a fail and a pass, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4. I think I maybe did 5 tests for this rather complex system. 5 very quick tests, because you just unplug something, check your signal, is it good here? Great. Start, put a new signal in. Does it go all the way through? No? Okay. We know where our failure point is between that break, and on this side, for example. So great. That gives me 5 steps every time, no matter where it is. And no matter where I start, I get the solution in 5 steps, right? Whereas like sometimes I get it in 3 and a lot of times I get it in 7. And the more complex your system, the more this binary troubleshooting tree comes into play, because when you start getting into like systems that we're working with in music production, for example, you have your controller, your USB cable, your computer. Now you have the software side, okay, that's the hardware side, software side. Drivers, is it class compliant? Is it a specialized driver that you have to install? Okay. Does your DAW interface with that driver well? Okay. Is your synthesizer active? Have you set your DAW to listen to said driver that is connected to your interface? You can go down this crazy list. Well, wherever the challenge is, use something that's working to test it so that you can split, okay, from here to here. Is it the hardware side? Okay, let's just test the hardware side, see if we can prove something's working. Is it the software side? Oh, we have this other thing that we can use to test within the software. Great, let's use that, see if it's working. That should get us the answer lickety split, rather than going through from one end to the other and finding yourself going like, oh my goodness, you're spending like half an hour, an hour, 2 hours on a troubleshooting problem that you ideally would be able to solve in like seconds or minutes. This can get you back to the thing that you actually want to do, the actual music making, the writing, the product development, whatever it is that your priority is. Ideally, you're going to get there as fast as possible using a binary troubleshooting tree. So what else can we get into? Well, specifically with binary and sampling. So sampling is a powerful system that allows us to measure audio waves and turn them into numbers that we can then do cool things with. Now there's maybe some if you have like some really old school friends who are like, analog is superior and all, yeah, it is in some ways, I guess you could say, in theory. In practice, it's just the fidelity breaks down too fast. It doesn't remain a superior quality audio signal, especially given some things we know about both humans and technology. So we already went over like analog signals get noise, and then that noise kind of perpetuates in the analog signal, and there's no way to extract the noise, without going into some digital process. And you might be thinking, what is this term analog? What does that mean? Well, remember how we have like, waveforms that are, compression and rarefaction? Well, if we use something like a microphone or some sort of way to translate or transduce the air pressure variations into an electrical signal, that electrical signal has current flowing strongly in one direction with the compressions and strongly in the other direction with the rarefactions. And the waveform that electrical waveform produces is analogous to the acoustic waveform. Therefore, the term analog. Anyway, we start with an analog wave, right? And then we measure it or sample it at a regular interval, right? And there are two things that we need to be concerned about with the resolution of our sampling. One is the x-axis resolution, or the frequency, sampling rate or sampling frequency, and the y-axis, or sampling resolution, or in our case, because our sampling is converted to binary, our bit depth. All right, with these 2 bits of information, we can do what would be considered a perfect digital capture of a band limited analog signal. Now, the band limited part is the really important thing here, because in order to capture frequencies of a certain value, we need to measure that waveform at a rate that will produce 2 samples per wavelength. At the bare minimum, I need to measure 1 peak and 1 trough in order to get, something that, I'm going to try to use yellow if possible. Right. So digitally, the highest frequency wave that we're recording digitally is recorded as a square wave. And if you remember from the basics of sound, the fundamentals of sound, a square wave is really just a sum of sinusoids that are odd number multiples. So if we take this square wave, and let's say it's at the highest sampling rate, whatever that sampling rate is, let's say it's 10,000 hertz arbitrarily. That's not a sampling rate we use, but let's just say it is for now. If we're at 10,000 hertz, the next harmonic partial of the square wave is 30,000 hertz. So all we need is a filter that cuts off any frequency, say above 20,000 hertz. So, because sometimes analog filters affect sounds a little bit that you don't intend to. So it's nice to have the slope of the filter outside of the range of things that you care about. So this is really cool, because that means that we can record any frequency given that we have the sampling that is double that frequency. Great. So what happens if I don't have a sampling rate that is double that frequency? Well, something really goofy happens. Let's use red for the original wave. So I've got my original wave, and then I'm going to sample it with blue. So I sample the wave, and then I sample the wave, sample the wave. Sorry, I need to go back to red again to complete this. And then I sample the wave again. And my resulting wave looks like this. Well, if this goes on and on, what we're going to get is a lower frequency wave that is a bit of a, let me turn this mouse off so it stops doing that. This lower frequency wave is known as an alias. And this lower frequency wave does not exist in the original analog waveform. It only exists because we sampled at the wrong sampling rate, or we allowed a high frequency tone into our digital system, and we get this weird artifact, this alias, this artificial low frequency tone that is not present. And this is a serious problem, because it can create icky, gross, terrible noises. I mean, you can make weird things that are kind of cool with it, but for the most part, that's not in the sound that we wanted. If you want to see kind of experience this in real time, open up Max 8 and open the phaser. Sorry, I might spell this wrong. It's phasor or phaser. I'm forgetting the exact spelling. It's one of those two. And open up the help file and put that phaser up at as high as it will go, and you'll start to hear weird things where it goes really high in frequency, and then you start hearing, while you're fading up in frequency, you're hearing a descending tone happen in addition to the ascending tone. That descending tone is the alias, a sound that should not be there. And that comes from producing a frequency too high for the sampling rate to reproduce, and therefore getting this weird aliasing artifact. You may also see it visually in the sense of, if you're dancing, in a strobe, and there's a strobe light that is strobing at a similar rate to your dancing, if we match the rate of the strobe to me dancing, you would get a picture of my hands in this position. I'd do a full circle with hands in this position, right? If you were perfectly in phase and in time with my rotational, kind of cabbage patch move here, you would see my hands just seemingly holding still. If you slow it down a little bit, you'll take a picture here, and then a picture here, and a picture here, and a picture here, and it'll look like I'm moving my hands backwards relative to the actual motion of my hands. So that's just a visual example of aliasing. So how do we prevent this? Well, we need to choose the band of audio that we want to record. And we really are mostly concerned about the upper limit. What is the highest frequency we want to record? Well, based on our understanding of hearing, we know that we're only really interested in frequencies between 20 and 20,000 hertz, right? And the difference between 20 and 0 is kind of negligible. So I'm going to say we'll record 0 to 20,000 hertz. All right, so what's the sampling rate that I need to record 20,000 hertz? Well, I need to at least record at 40,000 hertz. I would like to record a little bit more than 40,000 hertz, and conveniently, CD audio quality is recorded at 44.1 thousand hertz, right? And film audio quality is recorded at 48,000 hertz, or KHZ if you're into the notation, right? So this is kind of cool. We know that we can record the frequencies that are available to our ears with either of these sampling rates. I've lately become more favorable towards 48K because it lines up nicely mathematically, but also because it gives me a few more thousand hertz of bandwidth, right? So how do we prevent signals that exceed our bandwidth interests from getting into the digital system? Simple. We had a low pass filter. Right? So if I'm sampling at 48K, I need a low pass filter that cuts everything by the time it gets to 24,000 hertz. Right? And most of my wiggles that I'm concerned about kind of end here around 20,000 hertz. Right? So there's a range of frequencies that are getting attenuated, and there might be some artifacts and things that happen there, but that's not really my concern because, great, 20,000 hertz, that's my upper limit. Some people might hear like a little bit more than that. Some people might hear a little less than that, especially if they're not using hearing protection. But for the most part, this frequency range is not super concerning with us. If you're recording dog whistles and these sorts of bat calls, you might want to use a really high sampling rate. There are some systems out there that actually have like 96 kilohertz and 120, 192 kilohertz sampling rates, which for most musical applications is probably overkill. But for scientific applications where you're trying to like measure something really precisely and then slow it down, like if you're building a sample library, for example, you might want to record at a really high sampling rate. So when you slow the waveform down, you don't get that weird low pass quality to it. If you take a high note, record a high note on any instrument or any like sound or whistle, and then pitch it down, and you start losing stuff that was up above the sampling rate limit, which, if I'm being precise, is the Nyquist limit, named after Shannon and Nyquist, the two guys who founded the digital sampling theorem. They defined it as any band limited signal can be represented perfectly digitally with enough digital resolution. Anywho, if you're trying to make a sample library and you want to have really high precision samples that can be transposed way down and still have very clear fidelity, especially in the upper partials, you want to start looking at ways of sampling and recording at that really high resolution. Now, there's a lot of microphones that actually do not produce any audio above that, so it's not entirely relevant. Like if you're using an SM58, it's not going to produce a bunch of energy above 30,000 hertz. You might have to get your hands on some sort of, if you were doing this sort of mad science thing, you would need to get your hands on a device capable of producing electrical signals at that very high frequency. And those are few and far between at the moment. Anyway, what else is important about sampling? Oh, another important thing about sampling is our bit depth. Because this is where we have, so the sampling rate is the left to right or the x-axis resolution, and the bit depth is the y or amplitude resolution. And this is important for a bunch of reasons. One is if we want to capture the absolute maximum dynamic range of what we can hear in these sorts of things, we want more bit depth. All right, CD quality standard is 16-bit depth, and there's some math formulas. I'll save you the details on this, but there are formulas that show that we can record about 6 dB of amplitude for every bit that we use, which kind of makes sense because 6 dB is a doubling of amplitude, and every bit adds a doubling of the numeric values available to be recorded. So 6 dB times 16 bits, gosh, what is that? 36 plus 60, about 96 dB. There's a little bit more because of some of the signal processing things that happen in the system, but let's start with approximately 96 dB dynamic range. Well, that's pretty cool. Like our hearing range, our like effective hearing range, you could kind of think of as what? It's something like 0 to 120-ish, depending on the frequencies. But, that's generally the threshold of hearing, and this is the threshold of sensation, where you feel things in your ear canals and it's unpleasant. Even if you're hard of hearing, you still feel something there. So 96 dB, it's not quite 120 decibels. I would like to have a little bit more resolution. So if I'm recording and I have available to me the space, because 16-bit is certainly efficient. I can record a lot of audio at 16-bit because it's takes up that much space. If I add more bits, that's every however many fractions of a second of audio that I record using whatever bit depth it is, 16-bit or greater, it's recording a certain amount of data. 16 bits, that records 2 bytes per sample, and you're recording what? 48,000 times 2 bytes per second. Oh. So you have 96,000 bytes per second, right? Or is that? I'm gonna do some math here. Is that really how much it is? That seems like a lot. Wow, that is a lot. Sorry, it's it's not very often that you think about just how is it really that much? Dang. So that's why your hard drives fill up when you're recording audio all the time and not deleting anything. I was just thinking, how fast would I fill up a multi-terabyte hard drive? I would fill it up fast. Dang. Well, if we're using, let's say 24-bit, that's 3 bytes at this many, this many samples per second times this many bytes. Whew, man, it just adds up so fast. Dang, I didn't think about that. Well, anyway, these hard drive space is cheap. You get an external hard drive, you copy things. It's great. So let's not worry about hard drive space for the moment. But let's worry about something that's maybe a little more closer to home. If I can record a dynamic range of 0 to 96 dB with 16 bits, I can record quite a bit more with 24 bits. 24 times 6 is 24 plus 120. Ooh, now we're getting somewhere. 144 dB. What's the next chunk up? 32 bits. Now, Ableton Live does all its encoding in 32 bits. So when you print your audio out, you could print it out at 16-bit, so it's like CD quality and easier to convert to MP3s and this sort of thing. But if you are trying to, put out the cleanest, highest fidelity audio, you might want to export at 32 bits, because this happens to me all the time where I'm playing around with something. I'm not really paying attention to mixing yet. I'm just kind of experimenting, and I find myself redlining, like specifically on my kick drum sounds. If I'm before I engage like a mastering preset or anything like that, again, just when I'm exploring ideas, I haven't launched my mixing template or anything of this nature, I'm getting red lines. And that's all swell when you're just in the DAW. But if you export that at 16 bits, you might find you're getting little bits of distortion, like right at the most peaky parts. And depending on your genre of music and depending on your aesthetic for distortion, this might not be an issue. But if we're trying to be as faithful to the quality of the music as possible, we may want to actually export this at 32 bits so that we can get we can run some sort of process that doesn't just kind of clip or distort or soft clip or do weird things at those points where it goes a little bit beyond 96 dB. Because if it, even if it's just like 98 dB, that's still a signal that is distorted in some way. It's somehow being warped. And there are tools out there that once we get the audio in 32 bits, we should be able to go and kind of surgically alter those peak points so that they're nice and clean and the shapes are preserved as best as possible. So we're not having, that particular sound quality that comes out of an overdriven DAW. Yeah. All right. Next concept, number series. We have some cool number series that we've played with a little bit so far. We have the harmonic series, right? So if we have a fundamental of 100 hertz, the harmonic series is 200 hertz, 300 hertz, 400 hertz, so on and so forth, right? If you've watched Andrew Huang's video on the topic, he shows some really cool things, and it's a beautiful animation, and you should go check it out. I'll try to provide a link in the resources later today. But the idea is each of these intervals is, while it's numerically simple in the frequency domain, in terms of pitches, especially when you normalize for octaves, in terms of pitches, these relationships are very closely related to musical scales, in the sense that the difference between 100 and 200 is an octave. The difference between 200 and 300 is a fifth. 300 and 400 is a third. 400, 500 is a fourth. And we keep on going down the line to the, with the different intervals. And as we go down the line, they become increasingly dissonant intervals until we get to like a minor second or something of this nature. And this is sort of interesting when you look at it, because in terms of consonant versus dissonant, octave's the most consonant, fifth is the second most, third is the third most, conveniently. And that's kind of interesting, because now you're working with one series of numbers that has implications in another context. And that's where things get kind of cool with numbers, is that there's an abstraction in numbers that allows them to move from one space to another. And we can use that flexibility and that movability, at least in our minds and in our systems, to make cool things happen. Another number series that crosses systems all over the place is the Fibonacci series. Fibonacci. This series is defined as the next number in the series is equivalent to the previous two numbers. So if we start with 0 and 1, we got to start somewhere. So we'll start with 0 and 1, which sum to 1, 1 and 1 sum to 2, 1 and 2, 3, 2 and 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34. You might notice that I have this somewhat memorized up to a point. 89, I think this is 144, 233, and 377. I'm going to stop there because numbers get big. Okay, it's 610. Anyway, numbers get big. You probably can't see that. It's behind my face. 610. Anywho. This series is kind of interesting because, again, we have this relationship of octave, fifth, I'm not sure of that interval, but this interval is like 2, this interval is 1.5, this interval is da-da-da-da. Eventually the interval gets to a ratio of something like 0.618 or 1.618, depending on the number. And I'll get into why that's kind of cool later. But this series is also found in nature. When we see, if you look at plants, you'll see things that, you'll have one cell, and then you'll have two cells, which results in 3 cells. And then if you go to the joints of the cells, you end up with 5 cells, and then you have 8, just doing the joints again, you have 8 cells, 13 cells, and so on and so forth. And it's this natural progression where, you might see it in leaves, you might see it in seed patterns in different plants and vegetables and these sorts of things. And this pattern that appears in nature kind of has somehow, maybe it's intuitive, maybe it's somewhere programmed in, that there's an aesthetic to it. like we find it interesting or at least pleasing in some way. Another thing that happens with the Fibonacci series, if you have a square and a square and a square that's 2, and then a square that's 3, and then a square that's 5, and then a square that's 8, and then a square that's 13, and a square that's 21, so on and so forth. And then you take a point and you put it in the center of all the squares. And so these squares are not to scale because I'm drawing freehand and I'm not good at drawing. Oh, I put these in the wrong order. You'll forgive me for cheating a little bit on this hand drawing business. If we connect the dots, we get this cool spiral. And this spiral is also something that's seen in nature. We may have 2 of these spirals in our heads, in fact, with the cochlea. And snails, when we described cochlea as having a snail-like shape, the snail has that same kind of process where it's like, it's smaller, and then it's a little bit bigger and a little more mature and a little more mature. And, the maximum efficiency is to wrap over on itself. And you get this expanding spiral shape. The chambered nautilus has this kind of shape, if you've seen the fossil records and these sorts of things. Sorry about the hand drawing. It's not my forte these days. But I think you get the idea here, right? You see something that starts small and expands and expands and expands in this organic way. You may also notice when I was making the really like so drawing of the square, we have this relationship in a Fibonacci sequence square pattern that also creates this pattern. And there's something really kind of magical in this relationship. Let me see if I can get the color here. And that is something called the golden mean. So the golden mean is defined as when you split a line such that the ratio between the larger split and the smaller split is equal to the larger split to the whole line. That is called the golden mean. Now, let me switch to yellow for this. And the numeric relationship, the mathematical relationship, is known as the golden ratio. And the golden ratio is kind of interesting in 2 ways. One is when you're comparing the smaller to the larger is 1.618 times the smaller. And if you're comparing the larger to the smaller is 0.618 times the larger. Now, that's kind of a funny number in the sense that this part of the number, the after the decimal point, is exactly the same for the 2 numbers, where it's 1.618 is larger, 0.618 is smaller. That's sort of a neat thing in math when you have this I guess symmetrical relationship between the 2 parts of a ratio. And why is this cool? This could be neat in so many ways. Well, let's again refer back to aesthetics that are outside of music for a moment. If you Google image search golden ratio and faces, you will see, and forgive me for the hand drawing on this one, you'll see these faces that are of a certain ratio, and this one won't be it because I hand drew it, but there'll be ratios between the eyes and the mouth, between the whole head and the mouth, and then below the mouth or lips or nose. There'll be all these golden ratios between parts of the face, and faces that we find generally agreeably attractive across cultures are going to have more of these golden mean relationships than faces that do not have that. I mean, one, they'll be symmetrical. Sorry for the line, it's not quite straight, but they'll be symmetrical from bilaterally symmetrical, and they'll have these particular relationships between distance between eyes and the width of the head and all of these sorts of things that are all golden mean ratios. And it's kind of brilliant. So how can we use this in music? Well, we could think of a piece of a certain duration and go like, okay, I'm going to split that piece structurally such that the larger chunk of the piece will have the same or similar ratio in time to the smaller piece as that larger piece does have to the whole piece, right? And you've probably seen this before in very simple song forms. It's not perfectly accurate, but you have the A, B, C, A, B song structure, verse, chorus, verse, chorus, bridge, verse, chorus, right? The super simple strong song structure. I mean, that's really close to, especially if you did, if you added this one more, if you did a double chorus in the middle there. Oh, look at that. You would have a 5-3 relationship. 4-3 relationship is close enough to at least give us a bit of a number, and your bridge could be shorter than your verse or chorus. Therefore, you could get really dialed in there. But we already know that there's an aesthetic structure of a golden mean-like relationship between song chunks and the entire song. So that's a great tool that we could leverage in our own songwriting, especially if we're like, the song isn't naturally telling us we need to do the next thing, and we're just looking for an arbitrary thing to try. Here's a great thing to try. Try a golden mean split on a song of any duration. Now, keep in mind, I do understand that when we're working, especially in music that is dance music in nature, that has a regular beat, therefore you have regular bars and you have regular 8-bar structures and 32 and 16-bar structures, your split might not be able to land perfectly in time where it would be a golden ratio, but that's fine. Just modify it a little bit, make your split over here on the other side of that bar, especially if it's a number of bars that lines up nicely, a number of 8-bar phrases that line up nicely. That could be a fun thing to play with. And as you've seen with like kind of really hard hitting dubstep, you can sometimes cheat your bar length a little bit. If you have a 32-bar build and it just builds in such a way that you need a little bit more space before the downbeat of the actual drop, some people will just put in 2 bars in order to put that vocal sample or that drum fill or whatever it might be that gets you to the drop. You don't have to go build, and then drop perfectly with the timing set up by the build. You can insert something. So maybe that's what you do here is, if the split would split an 8-bar phrase, make a 2-bar phrase, and then go to your change. And voila, you have something kind of maybe aesthetically interesting. All right, tuning. So we already described a little bit about harmonic series relating to tuning system. And tuning systems are kind of interesting because they're really just numeric representations of cool stuff happening in music. And it allows us to, notate and abstractly record or plan musical ideas. So like the tuning system of the major scale is very closely related to the harmonic series. It's not perfectly related to the harmonic series, at least in contemporary Western music, because we made some weird rules when we started working with the piano, like for almost everything. We had to invent this thing called equal temperament. And that is where, let me take a step back. If you take the harmonic series and you start arbitrarily on a frequency and you go up by fourths or fifths or octaves, and then you take another pitch in the system and you go up by fourths, fifths, or octaves, there's a point where you're not very far off. You're only a couple octaves out from where you started, and pitches that should line up with each other no longer do. Their frequencies are off by a few hertz here and there, and that can create problems with harmonies when you have multiple instruments playing together. So our compromise to prevent this from being a major issue was equal temperament. And that just cheated the fourth and fifths a little bit so that they are not perfectly aligned with the harmonic series. They're off from it a little bit, but that little bit, that little compromise allows us to play scales in C, like a major scale in C, and then shift that major scale to F, and it still plays in tune. Whereas back in the day, before tonal harmony was a thing, before our number systems were advanced enough, you had a different scale for every pitch class, right? So like, the Aeolian scale was like, the major or the minor scale of C. I'm forgetting some of the details, forgive me for this. But each of the pitch classes had its own scale because that scale was harmonically tuned to that fundamental. So if your instrument was set up to play a certain scale, it didn't play another scale very well. Contemporary woodwinds, still have some weird fingering patterns. If they're playing a scale, like, if you're playing a B flat scale, it works beautifully. When you're playing, a G sharp, it's like, actually A flat's not that hard. But, you have fingerings that are more and less easy depending on the scale, but for the instrument. But piano, it's much closer. Yeah, there's the black key, white key shift, but it's not as severe as like memorizing very different fingering patterns, because the fingering pattern is there. It's just like, okay, is it a whole step or is it a half step? And is my half step between a white key and a black key, or is it the two adjacent white keys of B and C and E and F? It's a much different learning curve, I would say. So equal temperament changes the harmonic series in our tuning system enough so that multiple scales can be played on the same instrument without having to make any major changes or bending notes or this sort of thing. What else is cool about tuning systems? Oh man, tuning systems and harmony. Like think about the overtone series lining up with the major scale, and then what if we make a really weird other timbre and then play a scale that lines up with that timbre better than it does with the overtone series? That might actually give you some opportunities to play with some like really different sounding musical ideas. I'm thinking of like Balinese, gamelan drums, the metallophones and sorts of things like this, and how different that might be in terms of pitches due to the harmonics of the metallophones, because those don't have that clean like violin tone harmonic series. There are partials that are non-harmonic in a gamelan tone, just like in a crash cymbal. Like, when you hear a ride, you might hear a little bit of a resonance that makes you think of a pitch, but there's so many other frequencies present in that crash or that ride sound that it doesn't sound pitched. You can use the same cymbal on a song of a different key and it's not substantially different. Whereas your skins on your drums, you might tune the drums to the key of the song if you're being musically precise. So one other thing about tuning systems, oh yeah, just being able to manipulate things in terms of numbers, abstractly trying new tuning systems. Or if you're playing with a piano-based system, yeah, you're probably going to be playing with major and minor scales. If you're dealing with other, especially in computer music, where you can have arbitrary number systems, you can explore other tuning systems and see how they feel, because maybe you're looking for a vibe that's just different than the happy sad of major minor, right? You want something really out there. Explore some tuning systems, see what you get. So numbers and mapping. Now, we've talked a lot about MIDI, and you've seen several examples of MIDI using that range of numbers between 0 and 127. Let's see if I can draw that correctly. Yeah, that's just messy. I'm going to redraw that. 27. All right, 0 to 127. This is fine for so many things. Like we said before, 88 keys, that fits into 0 to 127, no problem. Where it becomes a challenge is when you want to have really precise control of things. I would say amplitude is probably fine. You can do decibels, 0 to 127 decibels. That should be fine. But the one that gets me all the time is, let's say I have a filter and I want to sweep the filter from its maximum to its minimum, and my filter is set up to middle C to some huge number up in the top of the range of the filter. I think 18 kilohertz or so is approximately where like the Ableton Live auto filter kind of maxes out. Well, when I start dividing this range of numbers, this approximately, a little less than 18,000 steps, and I divide that into 128 steps, I'm going to have to be making some pretty big steps up in the upper frequencies, which is fine. Our perception of frequency is logarithmic, so we notice at the lowest frequencies, just for defining logarithmic in terms of perception, at the lowest frequencies, like 10 hertz, there's a huge difference. An entire octave exists between 10 hertz and 20 hertz, between 20 hertz and 40 hertz, between 40 hertz and 80 hertz. As we go up in frequency, the amount of individual unit frequencies between the octave points becomes bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So the difference between 8,000 hertz and 16,000 hertz is a huge step, right? And this is why 128 steps is good enough for most of us using filter sweeps, especially if we're doing a gesture. We're not doing like, I need to land on this precise frequency exactly. If I'm just doing a gesture of sweeping up or a gesture of sweeping down, the 128 steps is fine. And given that our perception is logarithmic, we don't need to be able to hit 8,261 hertz to get a very precise frequency, because generally speaking, our frequency, if we hit these landmarks, somewhere in between there, we're gonna be fine. Because think about it, there's 12 pitch classes between 8,000 hertz and 16,000 hertz, and they divide up those 8,000 hertz like in 12 equal steps, and that's all good and fine. But what if I really do need a bit more resolution, and I need to hit a very specific spot that's maybe not perfectly aligned with a pitch class on that predefined logarithmic scale? Well, in computer music, not always in live, but in Max at least, we can combine two 7-bit MIDI streams into one 14-bit MIDI stream. Now, 14 bits gets us a bit more of a range, and I keep on using a bit, sorry about that. A huge, very significant, much larger range. So let me just write this out, because sometimes I forget the math off the top of my head. 11, 12, 13, 14. So this is 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2048, 4096, 8,192, 16,048. Oh, times 2. 16,348. Whoa. All right. If I'm looking for a range between, what was it, 261 to 18,000, the resolution difference between 128 steps and 16,000 steps is insane. And now I have the ability with 16,000 something steps to get very precise in my filter resonant frequency placement. So if I really want to get in there and just nail a frequency, and it's like not perfectly aligned with the predefined logarithmic mapping of 128 to the whatever the range of the frequency is, I can use this 14-bit system to really get in there. So some other things about mapping you've probably noticed with numbers is, So one thing with mapping and numbers is that if we're doing an analysis of audio and then using that to map over to MIDI, we're dealing with audio that is probably coming in at 16-bit, and we want to map that to something like 7-bit MIDI. Well, we don't need to use the full range of 16-bit audio to get our data. And this really comes into play when we're using the microphone and we're tracking the amplitude of the microphone, the peak amplitude, and using that to generate control data. We might find that, especially if we're far from the microphone, our range, that like the minimum range might be something like 0.01. And that might be the minimum of our range. And the maximum of our range might be something like 0.1. Whereas the peak amp maximum is 1.0. Well, I would then want to scale that or map that to 0 to 127. And thankfully in Max, you probably saw the Max patch. If you haven't had a chance, this is a fun one to play with. ZMap takes 4 arguments, 4 numbers, and you just type in, what's the minimum amplitude of my input signal, 0.1. What's the maximum amplitude that I expect to get? 0.01. What's the maximum amplitude? 0.1. And what do I want to scale that to? Well, I want to scale that to 0 to 127. Right? And that's, if you look at the code in the Max patch, that's what you're seeing. Now, if you find yourself using a microphone where you get closer to it and therefore your amplitude range is higher, you may find yourself adjusting this number. And if you find yourself in a noisy environment where there's a constant noise floor, you might find yourself adjusting this number, right? So, because we don't want the thing wiggling to react to the background noise. We want it to wiggle when we do something intentionally to control it. So this is just another example with a little bit of math, playing with numbers allows you to do some really cool and fun musical mapping. So filters are another fun game that we play with numbers. One of the filters that I've been noticing is very convenient to have in Ableton is the filter called Scale. So you may be thinking, wait, you were talking about filters. Isn't that like audio filters, like low pass, high pass? Yeah. Yes, that's true. But filters don't just mean changing audio signals. Filters are a thing that selects numbers and lets some numbers pass and some numbers not pass. Or instead of not pass, changes the numbers in some way. So that's precisely what the scale process does in the Ableton MIDI plugins. It lets you change the scale that you're playing. So if you play a chromatic scale with 12 pitch classes, so I've used this term pitch class just for review. It's the pitch class is the unique pitch element that is in an octave. And the same pitch classes exist in the next octave and the previous octave. You start on C, and you get to the next octave, and it's still C. It's C again. It's just a higher pitch of C. So we call the pitch class is that individual note, because C is the same whether it's C1 or C8 or whatever it might be. Obviously, the hertz is different, but perceptually, we still hear it as a C. So we have 12 pitch classes, and if we're filtering to a major scale, we're going to get 8 pitch classes, or 7 if you're counting the octave not as your part of your list, but I guess I'm going to count the octave in my list for this one. So we get 8 pitch classes. Cool. What if we do a pentatonic scale? Ooh, now we're getting down to like something like 5 pitch classes. Now that's kind of exciting. Maybe it's 6 if you count the octave. This gets kind of interesting because now you have to make decisions about things like, do we arbitrarily change the pitches that do not line up with the filter? And so if C is in my filter and F is not, when I play an F, does it get transposed to a C or a G, or do we just not hear it? There's an interesting choice for you to make. Anyway, these filters all play with numbers in some way. And again, it's not necessarily an audio filter where we're filtering frequencies. It's a data filter where we're filtering numbers that are not necessarily part of an audio signal. So what else can we think about in filters? Oh, something I like to think about in filters is a conditional filter. So that's where I have a condition. If my incoming number is equal to 100, then do this cool thing. This is the foundation, this filter concept, this conditional filter concept is the foundation of almost everything in computer programming, right? It's in a certain context, a very simple number, 100, causes all this other cool things to happen. Meanwhile, 99 does nothing, 101 does nothing, only 100 does something cool in this context, right? This can be really powerful especially I'm thinking back to MIDI mapping. When we were experimenting with the MIDI mapping ideas, we did no conditional formatting. It was all just like you did something in front of the camera and data went into the music and stuff happened. Well, that was sort of interesting in a proof of concept kind of way, but musically and performatively, it might not be great, right? Because that, like, I wave my hand, there's not a lot of precision there. It's rather abstract what results. Well, it might be more interesting to have an if-then statement related to where you are in your piece. So at the beginning of your piece, you might have more gentle movement, right? And this might trigger things, or, you might be moving your hand and it's playing a bell tree or triggering a harp or something like that. And then later in the piece, when there's more aggressive sounds happening, you might be making more like, aggressive movement, like a martial art kind of thing. And it would be cool if when you enter the video frame up here in the aggressive part of the song, something very particular happens that makes sense with the gesture. So the gesture shape itself isn't necessarily defining the musical output, but the context in which that shape happens defines the musical output. And that's where things get exciting musically, because we can actually make, what would you call it? We can make our performance match the music and make our music match the performance in fun ways where we don't have to hold our hands in this like really particular way like all the time. This was a mistake I made early on with MIDI mapping, is I'd find myself using a sensor that I had to hold just like this for the volume to be right. And now I'm trying to do other things and the volume's dropping because my hand gets, my shoulder gets tighter or something like this. Whereas if I just made a context where, just like when we use the gates on the mouse or the gates on the continuous controller, I only want the continuous controller to go into live while I'm holding down the gate. I don't want it constantly fluctuating parameters. Only if this gate is pressed will that continuous controller do something in the music application or DAW. So there's a way to think about numbers in terms of filtering. So in music, numbers get really fun in music, especially when we're thinking about things like a throwback to the Fibonacci series in the golden means, when we start thinking about structuring time. Because someone has figured out, at least several people have figured out, that what goes in the structure of time may not always be as important as the fact that it's structured, right? Our sounds are changing over time, and you may find as you get more mature as a producer that a sound that is not perfect on its own, right? You could sit there and tweak this, this bass sound for days and not really go anywhere. It's not until you start putting that bass sound in a musical context that is structured time that it gains its value. And you may find that you thought, oh, this sound is not perfect. But then when you put it in a mix with other sounds, suddenly it is the perfect sound, right? And if you tweaked it just a little bit further, it would stand out or not stand out. And while it would be perfect in solo, in its ensemble over time, it wouldn't work for you. So having kind of like number games in your head for structuring time can sometimes be helpful because it gets you out of the staying frozen in the moment too much. And someone who was like super famous for this was a guy named John Cage, who was famous for introducing like new sounds to music in the like early mid 20th century. He did like prepared piano stuff where he'd put screws and bolts and things into the piano strings, and when you play it, instead of hearing a standard piano note, it'd be a very percussive sound. And it was great because you could turn a piano into a sampler back in the day before electronics existed. This guy, he figured out structuring sound very, very early on, because he stopped studying harmony. He was studying composition up to a point, and then he just departed from tonal theory and harmony. Something rubbed him the wrong way, and he was looking for something new. And he started structuring time and then making arbitrary decisions within that structured time. And that philosophy culminated in a piece called 433. And for those of you who don't know the story of 433, let me bear with me while I tell this story. Picture yourself in a concert hall in the mid 20th century. A pianist walks on stage, sits down at the piano, sets sheet music out on the desk, starts a timer, closes the lid on the keys. After a few minutes and a few seconds, opens the lid, closes it again. After a few more minutes and seconds, opens the lid, closes it again. And then another chunk of time goes by. He gets up, bows to the audience, takes the sheet music and the timer, walks off stage. Right? In the meantime, the audience is not entirely sure what's going on, because in classical music, you'll often have these moments at the end of a song where the performers hold the dramatic pause at the end. The music, the last note is played, and there's kind of a resonance in the hall, and they just hold their position, and the audience holds their response for a second. And then the musicians all relax, and the audience goes, oh, the piece is over, and they clap. Well, this guy held that space for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. So the audience is kind of frozen in like, I'm respecting the performer's control of the stage for a moment here, and it's still going. This is weird. What's going on? And they start hearing the sounds that you don't normally pay attention to in a concert hall. Like if there's fans going, a HVAC system going, if the windows are open, you hear birds chirping or cars driving by or whatever it might be. Suddenly you're hearing different sounds. And this is all where the kind of the genius of Cage's structured time comes in, because there was a piano piece before that performance. There's a piano piece after that performance, and what he had in the middle basically made it so that there was a three-part composition. There was music playing, there was structured silence, and there was music playing. And this is the really weird part. It sort of doesn't matter all that much what the music was before and what the music was after, because he's created a structure in time, and that structure of time is impactful, right? 4 minutes of silence anywhere else in any day is not musically significant. 4 minutes of silence in a concert hall, deliberately placed between two music pieces where silence is not what happens, is substantial, you know? So more than just like a white canvas, where it's like, this is art and it's empty. No, it's a little more than art that's empty. It's structured time, and that's where things are cool. And you might be able to kind of think of this in your own work, because there may be points in time where something musically significant needs to happen, and the thing before it is only playing a supporting role, and the thing after that is only playing a supporting role. And those things do not require the attention to detail as the thing of importance. So this might be something to toy with from time to time, that you don't need to worry about every single detail. I mean, there will be times that you might come back to those details, but compositionally, you might not be worried about those details. As a producer, you'll go back and deal with the EQ, deal with the mix and this sort of thing. But as a composer, you might have to not think about those things for a second in order to focus on making the impactful part really happen. So there are games that you can kind of play to think about this. One game that Adam and I talk about a lot is the Exquisite Corpse game, and that's where you take a little musical fragment, or you generate a little musical fragment, and let's say there's 10 of you, right? Just for easy math, there's 10 artists sitting in a room. You spend 10 minutes working on a musical fragment. You print it to audio and hand it to the person to your digital left. That person is also working on something for 10 minutes. At the end of the 10 minutes where you hand the digital audio to them, they hand their digital audio to the person on their digital left. And you're sort of sitting in a digital circle, if you will, right? So 10 people times 10 minutes, 10 minutes each. So in 100 minutes, you would each have played with 10 song fragments and perhaps made 10 individual beautiful pieces that all of you have contributed to. Now that's a really kind of profound and powerful use of 100 minutes when you think about it. Like, how many songs can you personally produce in 10 minutes? How many can you produce as a group in 10 minutes? If you're going like, okay, let's work on the verse together. Okay, everyone's working on the verse. Okay, let's work on the chorus together. Everyone's working on the chorus. Or in EDM terms, everyone's working on the build. Okay, great. Now everyone's working on the drop. How many songs could you crush in that time frame versus, this time frame? Now, let's say the songs are not beautiful, but man, they could be really good starts to something, especially because you're not worried about things quite the same way. When you only have 10 minutes to do something, how much can you concern yourself with the minutia? I would presume probably not a lot. In order to do something musically meaningful, you have to choose the most meaningful things that you can do within those 10 minutes and go with that. So, that's just one fun number game. And, some other fun number games are like, just arbitrarily playing with numbers. Like something that I love seeing when you do it, like analysis of intentionally written music, you'll see these patterns of notes where, like, scalar goes up, and then there's a jump down, and there's a short scalar up, and then it kind of trills for a second, then it scalars up some more, and then comes back down, and then repeats back to itself. Well, like what some composers will do is go, oh, okay, that's good for the first repetition. The second repetition, I want to do the same pattern. I'm going to scale up, but this time I'm going to go up a little bit, trill at the top, and then go down a lot, and then shoot up, and then repeat to the next phase. So all they've done really is they've taken this little segment and flipped it over, and that's kind of easy to do with numbers, right? If you're dealing with a range of numbers between, I'll just be arbitrary here and say 0 to 12, and you have a pattern that goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, great. Now make that 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, right? So just flip the numbers against each other. It's kind of easy to do visually with shapes. And once you're entering it into a computer somehow in your DAW, now you're doing it visually with numbers and or shapes. Like I think there's an Andrew Huang video where he makes a unicorn into a musical thing, and at first he draws the shape perfectly, and that doesn't really work. So then he has to manipulate how he plays with the numbers, how the numbers shift over time. So you still see the unicorn shape, but it's not an exact trace of the scan of the unicorn. So these are just a couple games, reversing things, inverting things, inversing and reversing things are very quick ways to get musical ideas flowing, especially if you need something I see in like some of my favorite EDM is you have like something that goes forward, 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 back, forward, 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 back. There's like a repetition, an ostinato, and then there's something that kind of dissolves the tension of that ostinato, just kind of repeating itself infinitely. I hear this a lot in deadmau5's work in particular, because it just stands out. It's like, you have your repeated arpeggio kind of figure, and then you have a wub wub at the end of the phrase that kind of resets the palette a little bit, and then you can go back to that ostinato, and it doesn't feel so infinitely repetitive. So finally, I want to talk about numbers and chance, because chance is a funny thing. Excuse me. Chance is a funny thing in music production, and it's a funny thing in life when I think about it. I narrowly avoided getting beamed by a basketball at a game one time because a buddy of mine was sitting over here, like yells at me about some joke he wanted to tell, and I turned to be like, "What's up?" And a ball just zips by me. And if I had been sitting like this, I would have been like smacked in the face. But because I had turned to see what was going on, it just flies by me. And clearly I'm not paying attention to the game. Either is he. So it's not like either of us were like warning each other, hey, the ball's coming at your head, bro. It was just like a chance moment where, luckily I didn't get beamed just because this happened. And then, no intent was in there, and just somehow it worked out. This can happen a lot in music, and some people even will intentionally put themselves in situations where chance and luck come into play. You've probably heard stories of like Mozart playing die to make musical decisions and things like this, and then having to compose against those musical decisions and make interesting things happen. John Cage, who made the silent piece 433, was also famous for using chance in his operations because, again, when he was structuring time, there were many elements about what went in those structures that were not ultimately that important. So, if you had 5 or 6 cool sounds, you don't have to sweat and test each sound against the composition. Just choose one at random. If it is absolutely terrible, okay, maybe not that one. And anything other than absolutely terrible, great. Use it, move on, and keep on making something cool happen, right? So we can kind of take advantage of some of these ideas of like sometimes chance works out, sometimes it works against you, but, what would be better, making 5 pieces where 4 of them were utter garbage because you used chance and like it just didn't work out, and one of them is awesome, or trying to make one piece and not finishing it and then finding out it's sort of like whatever you have isn't quite there yet anyway. It sort of matches up with one of the 4 where it's like it's cool, sounds neat, but it's not awesome, right? So make 5 pieces, you get really one awesome one if you're lucky, right? Versus make almost one piece and it's not quite awesome. That's sort of a dark perspective on things. But if you look around at artists out there, you may find there's a lot of people who are producing more work, therefore more likely producing good work. There's a songwriter, I think I've mentioned it before, Jonathan Mann, who has written at this point like 4,000 something songs. And there's some songs that like get a lot of attention that are real ditties. And he said one day when he hit 2,000 songs, he did some analysis and he was like, yeah, about 70% of the songs are mediocre, 20% of the songs are absolute garbage, but 10% of the songs are pretty dang good. And when you're talking about 2,000 songs, that's 10% of 2,000 songs is 200 blinking songs, man. I am jealous of that because I have not produced 200 songs to begin with, let alone 200 songs that are like good, right? So I like the idea of exploring, and especially now that I've done some research on this, I'm exploring chance in the sense of like, when you're inverting things and playing games with numbers and this sort of things, you're not always making like really precise intentional choices. You're just manipulating numbers to see if something works. Well, if you find yourself getting stuck in a rut, go ahead and throw the dice or flip a coin. Use a binary tree and go like, okay, I have a certain number of choices. All of the choices seem like viable. I've thrown out the choices that are going to be garbage, that I already know in advance are garbage. And there's a bunch of choices that could be good. Great. Choose any of those choices that could be good and go. Let's do it. Let's go make some music.